Hello, Noxians and ne'er-do-wells. My name is TBSky, and occasionally on my videos, I will notice that one person, every time I upload a new video, one person will show up and ask for the same topic to be covered in their comment. Down in the comments, someone will leave the same comment over and over again, asking for the same topic to be covered. Now, I try not to encourage that too much because, like, sometimes there are topics that I'm just not going to cover because I'm not interested in them or because I don't have things to say, and I feel like that's probably really frustrating for someone who thinks that if they just leave enough comments on my video, eventually I'll cover it. That's unfortunately, it's not always true. But sometimes it is, and here's where I'm shooting myself in the foot a little bit because, yeah, this video was partly spurred on by the comments of one person in my YouTube comments who's been asking me to do it over and over again, and the reason I'm doing it is not because they pressured me to, it's because, well, it's a topic that I want to cover. It's something that's actually kind of important that I cover because it's part of my overall coverage of the League of Legends universe. So, Dominic, if you're out there, if you're watching, yeah, this video is for you, at least in part. We are going to be talking about the great empire of Noxus. Now, in order to talk about Noxus as it exists within the League of Legends, we have to talk about the history of Noxus, and not the in-universe fictional history of the nation, but the history of Noxus as a part of League of Legends lore, because in the very early days of League of Legends lore, what you had was essentially a Cold War parable or metaphor going on, where you have this world that has just experienced two very highly destructive world-spanning wars called the Rune Wars. And during the course of those Rune Wars, mages on various sides of the conflict started to invent terrible weapons of mass destruction. Essentially, this was rune magic, and it's part of why it's called the Rune Wars, and this magic was so powerful and so destructive that it threatened to destroy the entire world. And so, rather than face the threat of having the world wiped out because of some stupid war between nations, a group of powerful sorcerers and magicians and intellectuals came together to form an international body called the League of Legends, backed up by the power of the Institute of War. On the League of Legends, nations could come together, send their best people to duke it out on Summoner's Rift or the other fields of justice, and whoever did the best in these contests and these tournaments would get to enact their political will out in the world. So, for example, if there was a border dispute between two nations, then whoever's champions did better on the fields of justice would get to win that border dispute without an actual war ever breaking out. And if any nation should be bold enough to cross the League of Legends or to deny or to refuse to assent to the decisions made by the League of Legends, then they would face the full wrath of the Institute of War and the many powerful sorcerers and summoners that resided there. So what we have essentially is that the League of Legends itself was like Magic United Nations. Essentially, it was this international forum where nations could come together and solve their conflicts without actually getting into open world-spanning warfare. And so within the Cold War analogy that formed the core of League of Legends back then, we had a couple of superpowers that essentially stood in for sort of the broad sketch of the two sides of the Cold War, with various minor nations like Ionia and Bilgewater and Shurima on the side, and Targon kind of acting as minor but still important powers in the various conflicts. Standing in for the stereotypical values of the West, we had Demacia, which also stood in very much for sort of the stereotypical good guys in fantasy, with champions like Garen and Lux and King Jarvan IV and so on and so forth. All these good, noble, sort of heroic knights and, you know, kind-hearted sorcerers fighting it out, trying to make the world a better place and taking down evildoers and stuff like that. They very much stood in for the stereotypical good guys of fantasy, your stereotypical noble knights, your stereotypical good-hearted kings, stuff like that. They also, in the metaphor of the Cold War that we've got going on here, pretty much stood in for Western values, like the good values of you know, freedom and justice for all and kindness and, you know, equality under the law, so on and so forth. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but I'm simplifying. On the other side, we had Noxus, which stood in essentially for the bad guys in the Cold War. That is the USSR, China, the various affiliated nations that sat on that side of the political spectrum. Now, I should stress, the analogy isn't one-to-one. It's not like Noxus in the olden days was like organized around a Soviet system of workers' rights over, you know, the means of production. Nothing like that was going on. It was an empire ruled by an emperor, and they were expansionists and stuff. And they also took on most of the qualities of your stereotypical fantasy bad guy. So on that side, you'd have champions like Warwick, like Singed, like Swain, like Darius, like Draven, all of whom stood in for, like, Singed in particular was a guy who created chemical weapons of mass destruction to be used against civilian populations. Warwick was also a ruthless alchemist who tried to murder Soraka in order to use her heart as a component in a powerful potion he was developing, and who has then since become known as this bloodthirsty hunter, just killing people for sport and stuff like that. And Darius and Draven are a ruthless warrior and an executioner, respectively, whereas Swain is a usurping tyrant, taking over control of Noxus from its former emperor. So they all stood in for sort of the stereotypical bad guy fantasy stuff, and the division between good and evil back then was very clear. Now, in modern times, the picture has become a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced, but a lot of the influence of those original ideas still hold true. So, if you look at Demacia, what you'll still see is a hell of a lot of influence from Lord of the Rings, like a lot of Gondor aesthetic going on with a lot of white walls and great statues of kings and, you know, big wide open streets and a lot of white and blue and gold in their color schemes, which again is traditionally associated with fantasy heroes, whereas Noxus is defined much more in terms of, you know, red and black and steel and these very sort of brutalist architecture of the kind that you would see in again in a film like Lord of the Rings series. This is the kind of weaponry, these are the kind of buildings and the aesthetics that will be employed by Sauron's forces, the Uruk-hai, that kind of thing, and indeed Saruman. But the picture has become somewhat more complicated. Demacia nowadays has taken on a lot more of the qualities of feudalism. Like, it's a society that's ruled over by nobility and which tolerates very little diversity within its ranks. Like, if you're a normal person, that is, if you're a person who doesn't have magical abilities, then you are welcome in Demacia, and you can be part of the society if you conform to the social structure that is in place. If you are a mage, though, if you have magical powers or exceptional powers that Demacia cannot control, then at best you will be exiled, at worst you will be tracked down and executed on the spot. Noxus, on the other hand, presents itself as much more of a kind of a cultural melting pot style society where anyone who has capacity and capability can rise to the top in Noxus, so long as they're willing to step on the necks of everybody who stands in their way. So if you are a mage in Noxus, you are perfectly well respected because you have magical powers, and power above all else is respected in Noxus. But if you're a cunning trader or a really good diplomat, or if you're really good at anything in Noxus, if you can be the best at what you do, and if you can seek your own personal advancement and your own power, then you can be successful, respected, and powerful in Noxus. Where Demacia also kind of stands in for a type of conformist, almost semi-fascism nowadays, ruled by a noble class and with very little social mobility. Noxus has very high social mobility. Anyone can rise to the top, but they are also expansionists and imperialists. That is to say, they are constantly seeking to spread their influence to new lands. They're constantly seeking to conquer new territory because, again, that's what Noxus does. Noxus idolizes power, and one of the ways that you can increase your power as a nation is to take over other nations and other territories. So Noxus is constantly in a state of expansionist war with pretty much everybody who's on their borders. They have an ongoing military campaign against the Freljord. They are making incursions into Shurima that was going quite well until Aesir resurrected himself, and all of a sudden they have that thing to contend with. They have, constant engagement with the pirates of Bilgewater, who keep preying on their trading vessels, which they don't like. They've also mounted a failed invasion on Ionia, and they are in constant border skirmishes with the armies of Demacia. So Noxus is this very militaristic nation, but not a highly regimented nation. One of the points that gets made a lot about Noxus is, like, they don't really have a uniform for their armies. They don't really have a standard set of equipment. You use whatever weapon you're best at using. You wear whatever armor gives you the highest advantage in combat. Not to say that they're disorganized or chaotic, because, you know, you are expected to be a strong leader if you are a leader in Noxus at all. So there is an element of regimentation, but it's also a very highly individualistic society. It's a society that doesn't really value group values. Like, they don't really have the idea of group values or group rights. They're a place that values individual values and individual rights. So that comes across a lot in the aesthetic of Noxus as well. Like, when you look at, for instance, the weapons, the weapon designs that you've got going on here, everything here is strictly utilitarian. There's very little decoration going on insofar as you might see. It's very straight lines, it's very hard edges, it all looks very lethal and deadly, and mostly seems to be designed around the idea of maximum deadly efficiency. Certainly that's what's being communicated with the visual design, as indeed it was in Lord of the Rings, if you remember the way that the weapons of the Uruk-hai were contrasted against the weapons of the good guys in, you know, the armies of men and elves, which were much more artful and decorated. Then you have the Uruk-hai, which like, we churn out a bunch of weapons in a forge and they all look the same. Just grab a weapon, kill whatever you can with it, who gives a shit? And it also comes across in the architecture of Noxus, which, as indeed you can see here, there are no circles here. Unlike Targon. Like Targon, if you remember back to that video very long ago, Targon was all about circular shapes. Like Targon incorporated circles in all of the shapes, in all of the buildings, and all of the aesthetics. There was a lot of circles going on because Targon, of course, worships, among other things, the sun, the big circle in the sky. Noxus, not so much. There is not a soft line or a curve in sight. Everything is a regimented, rigid, strong, powerful, straight lines, you know, jutting up into the sky, towers proclaiming power, big walls proclaiming impregnability. Everything is regimented, straight, utilitarian, and powerful in Noxus. That is very much the aesthetic of the place, is meant to communicate not so much a rigid regimentation, because again, there's also no symmetry here, if you notice. Like, there's symmetry in individual buildings. We have the big major immortal bastion up here, which has a symmetrical design, but if you look beyond it, there really isn't a lot of symmetry going on. You see things jutting up all over the place, various, you know, design features being placed in places that doesn't really give it a uniform look, and you can kind of tell that everybody gets to build whatever the hell they want in Noxus, so long as they have the power and the drive to make it happen. There are elements of symmetry because there must be in architecture, but they're constantly broken up by other features and other design features. You can see here, you have these two towers here, which are sort of supposed to exist in a symmetrical design, but look at the wall here. It goes perfectly symmetrical here, but oh, all of a sudden there's a break in the wall. Someone decided that that wall had to be knocked down for whatever reason, which doesn't exist on the other side. And the same thing here, an unfinished tower on the backside behind this tower over here that doesn't exist over there. And you can kind of see it everywhere when you look in the city designs of Noxus, that there is lots of regimented lines, lots of straight lines, lots of very sheer walls, lots of, you know, statements of power from an architectural perspective. Very brutalist, the architecture of Noxus, very utilitarian, but also a distinct lack of regimented symmetry, a distinct lack of rules and order. Whereas if you look at the architecture of Demacia, you get much more sense of that order going on. And you can really see it even in, like, the uniforms of the guards here, right? This guard has a very nice looking uniform, it looks really cool, but he's holding a sword. And his helmet looks different, and he doesn't have the same shoulder piece, and not even the same bits on a lot of places, whereas this guard uses a polearm, has a very different helmet on, and has some different armor pieces going on. So everywhere you look in Noxus, there's a unified aesthetic. Like, they all have the same, you know, lots of red, lots of grays, lots of blacks, lots of all of that, you know, fantasy villain stuff going on, lots of that sort of proto-fascist aesthetic going on, but not a lot of regimentation, not a lot of uniformity between them. Noxus values the individual, even if they have a unified aesthetic. How exactly that aesthetic is expressed comes down a lot more to how the individual feels about it. And that's honestly something that's quite well executed, I have to say. Like all of the environment designs that we've looked at in these videos of the League of Legends universes, the environment artists have done a fantastic job of kind of communicating the nature and the disposition of the nations that they're portraying through the visuals. You can see it here again. There's very little symmetry in this image, but there's also just no soft lines anywhere. Even these curved arches here, there's no softness to them. They look rough. They look, you know, unpleasant, unfinished almost, and they're covered in details and spikes and shit like that just makes them look hostile and unpleasant to look at. You see lots of gates, by the way, lots of gates, lots of girders, lots of grids, implying a hostility. Like, these look like prison bars, essentially, which is something that shows up a number of places in the Noxian aesthetic. You can see, you know, over here, all of these sort of metal portcullises and gates kind of walling you off, someone saying you cannot pass through here. This expression of individual power, the power to stop someone going through, the power to make their own home a fortress. And that's honestly very well executed. Like, whoever came up with these region designs had a very specific thing in mind when it came to that, and they've honestly executed on it very well. Another thing that's important, and this is something that the Riot developers themselves say in their video explaining some of the aesthetics and the principles of Noxus, is that Noxus is based around a triumvirate of values. Like, they have 3 pillars of power that are supposed to inform the full range of what Noxus is as a nation. So you have, you know, personal power, you have vision, and then you have guile, like sneakiness, stealth, essentially. And these 3 pillars of strength in Noxus are represented by 3 people. We have vision, which belongs to Swain, who is the tyrant of Noxus, or at least the putative main leader of Noxus. You have strength, which is Darius. He's the he's not the grand general. I believe Swain is still the Grand General, but he's the war leader of Noxus. He's the guy who has most control over the armies. And then you have the third unnamed person who's in charge of Guile. And we can all infer from various bits of the lore that that person is LeBlanc and her Society of Shadows, or Order of the Black Rose, I think it's called. I'm actually forgetting what it's called right now. And that too is supposed to come through in a lot of the design of Noxus. In fact, the thing they cited specifically is this building right here, which is the Mortal Bastion, or the sort of grand headquarters of Noxus. Has these 3 pillars, 2 here and then 1 in the back, supposed to represent each of those pillars in Noxian architecture. And it's something that, if you look for it, you can find it in other places. Like, I have to be a little bit critical of it, because mostly when I look at Noxian architectural designs and stuff, what I see is a lot more 2s and 4s than I see 3s, which seems like an odd oversight, but you can see it in a few places. For instance, here, the battlements of this wall, this viaduct, whatever it is, it's lined with these sharp triangular shapes. And the same thing you can see in some of the weapon designs. Let's see if we can find those again here, where like occasionally you will find, for instance, the Noxian sword has kind of a triangular, there's no soft curve there, it's kind of a triangular design. I don't know if that's really intentional, though. I've been looking for triangles in a lot of these designs to kind of express this idea of the power of 3 as a central concept to Noxian ideology, but I can't find it. And it baffles me a little bit that the Riot designers brought it up in the post, because mostly Noxus does not seem to me to be designed around the power of 3s. It seems to be designed around the power of squares, the power of very much straight lines, occasional triangles, lots of squares, lots of, you know, flat surfaces, lots of rectangles. That seems to be the basis for how Noxus is designed. But according to Riot themselves in this specific video right here, the power of 3 is supposed to be ascendant in Noxus. I've been looking for it. I don't see it that much. I really don't think they managed to execute on that super well. I think the visual designers for Noxus went a lot harder on squares and rectangles, because they are much better than triangles at communicating this idea of solid, monumental power in architecture. Something which doesn't really come across as well in triangles, I don't think, because triangles are a somewhat more fragile shape to look at. But be that as it may, Noxus in general, I mean, like all of the regions in League of Legends, the visuals are very well executed. Like, you really do get the sense of a unified cultural aesthetic, like a unified culture that has sort of the same approach to life. No matter who they are, no matter where they come from, they have this same kind of similar approach to life, and that produces this very similar, same aesthetic. Now, the criticism that you can mount against that is that, on the other hand, yeah, Noxus has this very unified, strong aesthetic that communicates this idea of personal power, and, you know, we're personally very interested in seeing the creation of the Noxian Empire across the entire world, and so on and so forth. But what you don't get is a lot of personal aesthetic, right? So remember how we talked about the cityscape here? There it is. I talked a lot about how symmetry is constantly broken in this cityscape. And indeed, in all of the paintings of sort of Noxian architecture, symmetry is constantly broken, because Noxus doesn't value symmetry in the same way that Demacia does. The downside is, if Noxus is so concerned with, you know, individuality and diversity, and, you know, everybody bringing their own perspective and their own ideas of strength to the table, why aren't there more circles going on here? And that's sort of the tension that you have to manage when you create an aesthetic for a faction, in the same way that Riot has tried to do with Noxus, is theoretically, because Noxus brings in people from all over, like there's Shuremans living in Noxus, there's Demacians living in Noxus, there's Ionians living in Noxus, there's lots of people from Bilgewater, there's lots of people from Freljord, there's people from all over come together in Noxus as a nation and kind of try to make it there on their own. And you would expect them all to bring their own aesthetics to Noxus, and Noxus to be kind of this melting pot and mishmash of all the different cultures and all the different aesthetics that exist in League of Legends world in Runeterra. But the trouble is, if you do that, if you embrace that kind of cosmopolitanism, what you lose out on is the ability to create something like this, something that communicates the idea of you know, monumental power, of solidity, of powerful defense. And they touch a little bit on that tension in the video. Let's see if we can find the damn page again. Wait, hang on. Oh, there it is. All of a sudden I thought I closed it down. They touch on that somewhat in this video, that there is a little bit of a tension between, this is an image which we've got elsewhere, which is Noxus's outposts in Shurima, where you see a little bit more of the mix and match between the two cultures. Let's see if we can find it for ourselves. Here, where one of the things they note is that the Noxian governor who rules over this particular port in Shurima has started wearing Shuriman clothes for himself, started adopting more of the Shuriman aesthetic into his life. And that's a really good idea, but I would like to see that executed on a little bit more in the rest of the Empire as well. Like, if the idea is that this is this place where everybody brings their own individuality to the table, and from that you forge something unified that can, you know, take over the world, then I'd like to see that explored on a little bit more. I'd like to see less of this unified monumentalism that kind of infects most of what Noxus is otherwise. So, the history of Noxus inside the game. Now, this one is a little bit tricky to nail down, because it's one of the things that Riot hasn't super gotten around to doing a lot of stuff with yet. Like, we know that Noxus started out as a group of basically barbarian tribes, just kind of living their own individual lives, having their own individual cultures, having their own individual whatever in the Noxian area, and they all fought each other all the time. And then along came Mordekaiser. Now, many, I think it's thousands of years ago in the past of the League of Legends history, Mordekaiser arose as a powerful sorcerer king who essentially managed to get himself immortality by becoming a lich and having his remains, like his phylactery, looked over by a group of powerful sorcerers who were essentially enslaved to him, and every time he died, he would be brought back to life by these sorcerers by using, you know, the powerful magical components, his skeleton, his corpse, to bring him back, bring his spirit back to the world and encase it in this grand armor that served as his home. And he dominated the areas around Noxus for many, many years. He just subjugated tribes all around the world, and he created this terrible necromantic hellscape of a nation, which was just absolutely awful. And in order to centralize his power over that nation, he created the Immortal Bastion, which is the grand capital of Noxus to this day. So this is this grand necromantic fortress that was created by a terrible warlord who rose up to essentially assert dominance over the entire area of Noxus and try to spread his dominance to the rest of the world. Eventually, people had enough of it, and various alliances of tribes across the realm of Noxus rose up to challenge him and try to defeat him. And they failed for a long time until a sneaky thief managed to steal away the bones, the skull and bones, and the corpse of Mordekaiser, the tether that was holding him to the world so that he could never be defeated in combat. And with that stolen and interred upon the Blessed Isles that would later become the Shadow Isles, Mordekaiser was defeated, and the nation of Noxus was able to rise up in his place, taking over the Immortal Bastion and making it their capital. Now, in the ages since then, Mordekaiser has been revived after the disaster that happened on the Blessed Isles to turn them into the Shadow Isles. That's the whole story of the Ruined King, a thing we don't really have time to go into here. Mordekaiser is back, and he's plotting to take over Noxus once again. But in the meantime, Noxus has become a very formidable empire, so they're not under any immediate threat from the hordes of undead that spill forth from the Shadow Isles. Now, the person who stole away Mordekaiser's corpse is presumed to be LeBlanc, thousands of years ago, because LeBlanc is this gestalt entity that transfers itself from host to host over the centuries, and thus has managed to survive up until the present day. And LeBlanc is presumed to be one of the de facto leaders, as we mentioned earlier, of Noxus, standing in for the principle of guile in the triumvirate that Swain has managed to create amongst the leadership of Noxus. And that's kind of as far as the history of Noxus really goes. Like, they also have a ill-fated campaign against Ionia, where they attacked Ionia and tried to conquer it and take it over, but they were eventually turned back by the unified armies of Aurelia, and indeed a lot of the magical power that resides on those islands. And the Noxian invasion of Ionia is very central to the history and the culture of Ionia, and a lot of the Ionian champions now exist as some kind of reaction to the invasions of the Noxians. Like Saya and Rakan exist because of the invasion of the Noxians. That's why they became a couple. That's why they became so focused on warfare. They really want to kill Noxians. Kain is the same way. He has a massive grudge against Noxians. So does Aurelia. So does Akali. A lot of Ionian champions essentially exist with some kind of reaction to the invasion of their homeland that has become the central moral conflict inside the nation of Ionia to this day. And I think that's pretty much about all there is to say about Noxus, because this is still very much, as I've mentioned many times before, a work in progress. Noxus is not finished, and not a whole lot of stories have really been told about Noxus itself. Not a whole lot of its history has really been laid out yet. We have some short stories, we have some comics involving Draven and Darius, and their history with Noxus and the leadership thereof, and we have some implications coming from the lore of Swain, but exactly where Noxus is heading for the future and what most of its history is has not yet been really expanded upon. So, if you liked this video, there's a like button down below, which I would very much appreciate if you clicked. I also have a subscribe button, which is an exclusive feature that has been granted to, like, just my YouTube channel. I'm the only one. I'm the only YouTube channel that has a subscribe button. So if you want to try and test that out and see what that feels like what it's like to click a real, actual subscribe button, you can go down below and you can have that exclusive experience only on my YouTube channel. You just click that subscribe button and then you can unsubscribe and resubscribe and unsubscribe and resubscribe and unsubscribe and resubscribe. But don't do that too much, because the algorithm thinks something weird is going on and then my videos get demonetized. I think, I don't know, everything gets videos demonetized these days. If you did not like the video, that's of course perfectly okay as well. There is a dislike button down below that you can click on, but there is a 1 in 15 chance that the dislike button will have a powerful grudge against you, eventually mount an army and launch an assault on all of your territories with the aim to bring it into a grander, unified dislike button hegemony that will dominate the history of the world for many thousands of years. So be a little bit careful about that. Now, if you are so inclined, I do have a Patreon, and if you have $1 that you don't need, then I would be very grateful to have that dollar. Like, it's, if you have $1 a month that I can use, then that helps me out a lot, because it helps me pay for food and also, you know, have a place to live. I like having a place to live. It's nice. But if you don't want to do that, of course, that's completely okay. So at this point, I think all is really left to say is thank you very much for watching. Please don't spam my comments with requests too much, but do tell me what videos you want me to do in the future, and I'll see you next time.